Korea had been a Japanese colony from 1910 to 1945, and after the defeat of Japan in the Second World War, the Japanese had to leave, and Korea was split into two zones, in the American zone in the south and the Russian zone in the north. And in the beginning it was just like that they all thought it would be an independent, unified Korea, but it didn't work out that way. So the American man in the south, Syngman Rhee, he started some dictatorship there, and the guys in the north got a communist named Kim Il-sung into business. And he very much started to develop the country on his own terms. Not like the Eastern European communist countries, he tried to find his own way, not just being a Russian colony. And he used cinema to promote his kind of political developments very much. Of course, in the middle of the last century, cinema was used by all countries for propaganda, like by the Nazis, by the Russians, by the Americans. But North Koreans take it, put it to new extremes.
Today's Pyongyang is a great creation which dear comrade Kim Jong-il has brought about by wisely leading the people.
The North Koreans set up a documentary studio right away. They made their first documentary in 1946. And their first feature film was released in 1949. It was made with help from the Russians. But it tells a very different story from what the Russians would have liked. Because the film is called My Hometown, it tells the story of some farmer, and he gets in trouble with his feudal lord and goes to prison. And in prison he meets a propaganda guy for the Kim Il-sung run independent army. Then they escape from prison together and go to the mountains, to Mount Pakdu, the kind of holy mountain of Korea, and join the guerrilla army there. And then of course they take over the hometown and liberate the country. From that point on, the North Koreans told the story. It was according to their movies and the propaganda. It was not the defeat of Japan by the Americans that liberated America. It was they tell the story that Kim Il-sung was near Mount Pakdu in the mountains and had the guerrilla army, and this guerrilla army liberated Korea. They don't admit any involvement by the Russians in that. Although, of course, in truth, Kim Il-sung was just a Russian soldier stationed in Siberia for most of World War II. But anyway, with this start, he pretty much set up what he would tell later on. The Korean War started in which the Northerns tried to take over South Korea. And they were very fast. They pushed the Southern troops down to near Busan. But then the Americans landed in Incheon with UN backing and pushed the North Koreans back to the Chinese border. And then the Chinese, Mao Zedong, sent his troops in, labeled volunteers. And they pushed the Americans back to basically where the war started, the same kind of border on the 38th parallel. And there they had just like trans fighting for like 3 years. And then they came up with a truce in Panmunjom. And of course, during the war, on the one hand, a lot of the film studio was destroyed, but on the other hand, they made quite a lot of movies in the north, war movies, to propagate the Korean war efforts. Very anti-American, of course, was the enemy. And this genre would go on and stay with the North Korean cinema up to now. So that was basically the two kind of founding myths. The Kim Il-sung secret army and the Korean War, which they declare they won.
털같이 총에 맞았구나. 야, 안가를 소리라.
And then after the war was over, of course many more war movies were made, but they also started the films of like socialist development, kind of factory worker movies, telling the people to work harder, to build up socialism, Kim Il-sung version of socialism. And then in 1955, the concept of juche was introduced by Kim Il-sung, which says self-reliance, that the North Koreans have to do everything on their own. And he also stopped largely importing movies. And in that way, of course, people had only North Korean media around them. It was illegal, or still is illegal, to listen to foreign radio or to watch foreign TV. And so it was this very isolated country, and they were just bombarded with propaganda all the way through. And all these movies made in the late 50s up to the mid 60s were all very poorly made. It was all pretty much trash. But it was a young guy, it was his son of Kim Il-sung. And he tried to get up on top of the power pyramid. He wanted to succeed his father in power, which would be a first in communist history. So, and to impress his father and to prove that he had the skills to manage propaganda and to manage the masses, he became the kind of the commissioner of cinema in 1966, I think. And he very quickly got into totally restructuring North Korean cinema. And the first big film he made was Sea of Blood, a two-part movie made in 1968. And this movie, it was very much like reinforcing the old story that already my hometown, the first film, had told, that Kim Il-sung is the greatest and only his army liberates the country. In this case, they fight against the Japanese in Sea of Blood. It was followed up in 1972 by a movie called Flower Girl, which was the biggest production up to then. Telling the story of, it's more like an anti-feudal film. It tells the story of a poor girl and her brother rebels against the landlord again. So he is thrown into prison, and then the girl starts to look for him, but she is told at the prison that he died. So she goes totally desperate, and she has a younger sister who also goes crazy. So up to like 10 minutes before the end, it's like very big drama, and it seems like it must end in big disaster. But it doesn't, because suddenly the Kim Il-sung army comes, and it turns out that the brother didn't die, that he joined the army, and that the girls get rescued, of course. So it's Kim Il-sung's revolutionary army again that saves the day. In the late 70s, we're famous for two movies. One is called Anjung-gung Shuts Itohir Bomi, and it tells very much in detail the story of a young Korean nationalist who killed the Japanese emissary in 1910, so right at the beginning of Japanese rule, because the Japanese were not so welcomed by the Koreans, so they had all kind of resistance movements. And that movie doesn't mention any Kim Il-sung, because it was clearly set in a time before his activities. So it's a purely anti-Japanese, very nationalistic movie. The other movie, it was actually made in 1982, then, was Bolmi Island. And that tells the story, the North Korean version, of the Incheon landing. And that's kind of incredible, because it was like 50,000 US Marines landing on Bolmi Island in the harbor of Incheon. And it was like a tiny group of like 15 North Koreans with only 4 guns who stopped this whole invasion for a long time so that the North Koreans can regroup. Of course, great movie, much action, but of course historical truth is different.
That night, the Pyongyang citizens expressed thanks to their fatherland and to the party and leader.
In 1978, South Korean director Shin Sang-ok came into play. Shin Sang-ok started out right after the war in South Korea, and he was always like a very kind of social, critical filmmaker. But he was very successful, and in the 1960s he ran the biggest film studio in South Korea. It was his own, Shin Films. But then in the 70s his success went downhill, and also he didn't like the censorship of the government. So they put him more and more into pressure. And of course, there was much speculation in South Korean media that he had defected to the north, and also that he was kidnapped. So nobody knew for sure. And the way Shin Sang-ok himself tells it is that he was kidnapped, that he was some friend, some Korean guy, or what he thought was a friend, put him into his car, and there were some kind of secret agent guys who put like a sack over his head and pepper spray into the eyes, and they put him to the harbor and on a boat to North Korea. And so that's the Shin Sang-ok version that he always tells. And then in North Korea, it was, of course his wife had been personally picked up from the harbor by Kim Jong-il, she tells. And he really wanted to have her in the film business and put her in a very good guest house. And Shin Sang-ok was also put in a guest house, but he didn't know that his wife was there. And he tried to escape and went to prison, but was released very quickly. And then he tried to escape again and went to a concentration camp for like 3 years. And then he was released again, and he claimed that he converted to North Korean ideology, and he was reunited then with his wife by Kim Jong-il himself. And he immediately started to work in film. Now that's the version he tells now, but there are other people who think it's impossible that he made all these movies just in such a short time. I mean, his time in North Korea was not so long, it was just 8 years altogether. And he made 8 movies there and was producer of another 13. He changed so many things in North Korean cinema. He was the first to shoot a North Korean film on a foreign location in Czechoslovakia at the Barrandov Studios, the Emissary Unreturned, which tells the story, also some very nationalistic story from the early part of the 20th century. It tells the story of a guy who goes to Den Haag, and in Den Haag they have some kind of Korea peace conference in 1903, and because nobody wants to listen to the Korean side, and it's just like the big powers talking who is going to take Korea, so he commits harakiri at the conference, and it actually did happen as far as I know. So he turned this into a movie, and the film was shown in Kalavivari, and it was there that Shin Sang-ok suddenly appeared in person and gave interviews to the South Korean press and said, I went by myself, and I'm very happy to make films for the great leader Kim Il-sung and the dear leader Kim Jong-il. And he made some other movies, but he usually tried to stay out of big politics in his movies, so he liked kind of historical themes, so he could tell stories without really being hardcore Kim Il-sung propaganda, although some films pretty much are. But they are all set before the liberation. And the last film he made there was Bulgasari. It was a North Korean version of Godzilla. Yeah, after the completion of this movie, Shin Sang-ok and his wife went to Europe to promote North Korean cinema. So they went to the Berlin Film Festival, and then they went to Budapest, and then they went to Vienna. And in Vienna, he and his wife managed to get away from their North Korean minders and to run to the American embassy and ask for asylum. And of course, the Americans were happy to oblige and to say, okay, come to America, make movies for us. And then, of course, he gave all these interviews saying that he was kidnapped to North Korea and that was his escape now. Nobody knows for sure at the moment. After we can read the North Korean security police files, like we can read the East German police files now, then we will know for sure. Anyway, that must have been a really big blow to Kim Jong-il and his film industry. Because also many films in the period of the early 80s, mid 80s were very liberal compared to the movies before.
웬님이냐? 이놈은 벙어리가 됐느냐? 이놈을 당장 오라를 지워라. 예!
And they also made the sword fight movie with support from Hong Kong and Hong Kil-dong. And that really was the first movie that was made purely for entertainment. It's just a great sword fight action movie. Of course, it's nationalistic. It has the black ninjas from Japan coming in and robbing the crown jewels and the girls. And so they are defeated by a unified Korean army consisting of like the government troops, the farmers, and the robbers from the forests. So of course there is a nationalistic element in it, a very strong one. But on the other hand, it's just entertainment. But all that changed, all this liberal kind of stuff changed very much after Shin Sang-ok had left. It was also then at that time that Gorbachev got to power in Moscow, and the Soviet Union started to develop in a different direction. And Deng Xiaoping started his reforms in China. So it was suddenly the situation changed very much for Kim Il-sung, because before he could rely that they would both support him and that he could play one against the other. But now it was just they both just cared about their own stuff, and they both wanted to get away from the like heavy-duty communist things. So at that moment, like in about 86, 87, movies got very heavy again. Very hardcore propaganda. It was just incredible. It was just like they did miracles one after the other. The Korean War was won again and again. They started the biggest film series in the history of cinema, called Nation and Destiny. And Nation and Destiny is supposed to have 100 parts. The last thing I checked, we're at part 55. This poem here, and based on this thing, we have to make this 100 movie series. And the poem basically just says, I went around the whole world, but I like Korea best.
The water jets make the air fresher.
It's very much kind of nationalistic, but of course Koreans are generally very nationalistic, and they have been it before Kim Il-sung started the country. And in the south they're very nationalistic. So that has a Korean tradition that has continued to see Korean as kind of special people who always fight against invaders but never invade the country. But then it is turned towards the juche, towards the we have to do it all on our own. The juche is the main propaganda, or has been, because now it's upstaged by jong-un politics. And jong-un means military first. It's like in classic Marxism, it's like the working class. It's the important class that leads to communism. But according to the new version of juche, the jong-un version, it's the military. It's the most important class, and it will achieve paradise. So, and then of course, since the Korean War, the military has been very big, both in society and in movies. And of course it's openly propaganda for jong-un politics, military, most important part of society. And of course, nothing good comes from the outside. But the brothers and sisters in the South must be liberated, and the Americans must be kicked out.
The citizens of Pyongyang fully enjoy the right to work and rest. On this spring day, Pyongyang citizens express thanks to the leader and the party for having provided them with the biggest people's fun fair in historic Manbyongdae.